Good morning, colleagues. Thank you and a warm welcome to the PURCO SA Ponder virtual presentation series. We will commence with a short presentation lasting about 30 minutes, a question and answer session of 10 minutes, and conclude with a lucky prize draw. You are welcome to field questions in the chat box during the presentation, which will be answered during the question and answer session. This morning, Vlok will enlighten us on a trending and very interesting topic, the mandatory workplace vaccinations debate. In this Ponder presentation, Andre will explore the debate around mandatory workplace vaccination policies, what the law says, your rights as an employer and employee, and how to avoid and manage conflict. Andre Vlok is a conflict and employment dispute specialist and negotiator at the Conflict Resolution Center in Port Elizabeth. Andre, who practiced commercial and employment law for more than 20 years, founded the Conflict Resolution Center in 2017. He is widely acknowledged as an expert in conflict and employment disputes and negotiation. Andre writes extensively and is a regular expert guest on national radio and television. He presents a popular Thank you, Andre.
Hello, Ayabelela.
Hi, Andre. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, we seem to be having some sound or video trouble on my side.
I can hear you, so you can continue.
Okay, good. Good morning, everyone. Ayabelela can tell me if there's sound or video problems your side.
There's no research for that. Electricity.
I can hear voices as well. Can we have a look at that?
Andre, you can start. It's the people that we've been admitting into the meeting, so we're just going to mute everyone.
Okay,
so you can begin.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here and to spend some time with everyone on this very important and very difficult topic. The topic is certainly, in my 30 years of dealing with employment-related conflict and disputes, is certainly one of the most difficult ones that I've had to deal with. And I struggled with it emotionally, ethically, and legally. The last 4 months, we've been spending a lot of time on the road, at workplaces, factory floors, and we've been listening to people, both the employers and the employees, labor unions, and their various representatives. So we've formed a very clear picture of what is going on and the developing debate around the so-called mandatory workplace vaccination policies. Now, I think for most of us South Africans, the very thought of anything being mandatory conjures up images of enforced coercion, decisions not freely made, and I think most of us are very uncomfortable with that. The point of departure, therefore, is to have a long, hard look at that very word mandatory. Why is it necessary? Why do we have to have the discussion in the first place? The science seems to be clear for some of us. The protections, the risk after 18 months of COVID seems to be clear to most of us. How do we approach the debate in a manner that is not ethically or legally risky or offensive to any of the parties? Now let's look at the parameters, the fence lines first, so that we can understand the problem, and then we must spend some time and look at some of the solutions which we've found to work during these last 4 months. Even as recently as 2 months ago, the prudent employer often sat back and said that we'll wait this out, we'll wait for the science to develop, we'll wait for the legal position to develop, we'll wait for a bit more information. Now, that has rapidly changed. It changes on a weekly basis from where I'm sitting. The employer is under particular pressure from all sides.
Andre, you're muted. We lost you at pressures from all sides.
I didn't touch a button, so I think I was muted on your side. All right. The employer is under tremendous pressure and growing pressure. The commercial world, thanks to globalization, we're already seeing incentives and very thinly veiled threats from international partners, where they only do business with vaccinated commercial entities. We are seeing the same type of pressure from service providers, from clients, from insurance companies. You're starting to see very real consequences as far as insurance premiums are concerned, claim policies, and so on. So the employer no longer has the luxury of sitting back and saying that let's wait for tomorrow, let's wait for a better day, let's wait for more clarity. On my desk, I have 8 letters of demand from attorneys in all across South Africa, demanding all sorts of things from employers on behalf of employees, where the general complaint is that the employer is allowing unvaccinated employees to enter the workplace to work with their vaccinated clients. So the poor employer has really simply run out of time. It is tempting maybe, but certainly not responsible in our view to sit back and to wait for better days. Our starting advice is for an employer to sit down and to really spend some time, think this through, look at all the ramifications in your specific industry. Of course, that's very industry specific, and to design sooner rather than later, to design a very specific tailor-made policy for that specific workplace, dealing with all of these dynamics, and a policy that is dynamic enough to grow with scientific, with commercial, with legal developments as things go along. And as I said, in the last 4 months, I'm sure that will slow down, but so far we see developments on nearly all of those, in all of those parameters on a weekly basis. So how can we make this better? How can we have the conversation in a manner that is ethically, morally, and legally, and let's add medically acceptable? I think part of the problem is in the language that we use. The very reference to mandatory, I think, in our experience, is unnecessary. We're not talking about mandatory vaccinations, and I think it's time that we move on from that phrase. No one can force you to be vaccinated, regardless of the science. What we're dealing with, what the debate is really about, and what we should start focusing on, are the consequences of that decision. Yes, you have a decision to be vaccinated or not. Of course you do. But what are the consequences, especially at the workplace, if you make a decision not to be vaccinated? Once you turn the lens through which we see the debate rather to a management of consequences, we step away from some of that loaded language, and I think we start looking more at the real concerns, what we should be dealing with. Now, it's heartening to see over these last 4 months also that in the trenches we find that a well-designed policy certainly resolves a lot of the questions we see in the media, a lot of the perceived problems, and a lot of the problems we see around us and we hear around the braai fires and on social media. We start as a pattern so far. We start with let's take a factory where there are a few thousand employees. We start with a good 30 or 40% of people. Once we consult and design the policy, we start with very close to 30 or 40% of employees being very hesitant to be vaccinated. And as we go through the layers and the steps of the process, we find that that percentage drastically reduces. And countrywide, in the last 4 months, we've seen we end up with single figures employees who are still at the end of that process, still reluctant and unwilling to be vaccinated. And we'll get to just now, we'll have a look at how to deal with that. So in a nutshell, given the time that we have available to us, our advice to employers would be to have a policy, have one designed specifically for you. Be very careful not to use a one-size-fits-all approach. You have both a legal and a moral duty to provide a safe working space and to consult. Those are obligations which, both for practical reasons and legal reasons, you really shouldn't try to get around with or build in any shortcuts. What you're aiming at is a compassionate process. What you want to build here is not to coerce, not to bully your employees into compliance. It's not going to work. It's not going to last. It's not going to stick. And that creates problems further down the line for you. What you need to aim at is a process that convinces, a process that brings people in and make them feel that they've arrived at this conclusion with you. We see, especially in Gauteng, for some reason, we see that some employers wish to, it's seen as an irritation, it's seen as another box to tick, and they rush through the process. They all but bully their employees into compliance, and that we're already, even in a short period like this, we're already starting to see problems arising from that. As we on my Twitter page, for example, on the Conflict Conversation blog, we've got some articles if you need to look at that, helping you with how to convince people, having these difficult conversations. We must remember from the employer's perspective that these are not, and we see the mistake being made in the media and on social media, and certainly in the workplace as well. These are not conversations where simple facts, where objective facts are good enough. We find the research, the case studies, and practically on the factory floor, we find that a factual argument, you bring your science and I bring mine, you bring your YouTube videos and I bring mine, our various experts, that type of debate, that type of argument in the workplace on a topic like this is counterproductive. It even has a name, the Boomerang Effect, where the more we escalate those arguments, the more we entrench people in their views, the very view that you want to change. So the correct approach with this type of conversation, this difficult type of conversation, and conflict, if you want to call it that, is an entirely different tool, where we understand that this is about people's identities, where we understand that this is about people's value systems, and to change that is not a simple challenge. To change that takes patience, it takes compassion, and it takes skill. So what your policy should make provision for that. Your policies should be designed to implement the realities of that conflict resolution gives us. The tools that it hands us must be implemented. It may take a week or two longer. It may interrupt and interfere with your commercial and programs and goals and timelines. But it's certainly with an important issue like this, which undoubtedly will have legal ramifications and branding ramifications, as we see with the discovery decision of 2 weeks ago. This needs to be done properly. It needs to be done with care. It needs to be done correctly and skillfully. The prudent employer will certainly reap some good rewards that way. The framework is there, both legally and as far as the employment, the workplace itself is concerned. In many respects, for example, if you want a point of departure to get your head around it, look at, for example, a retrenchment process. We need to consult. We need to discuss alternatives. We need to even right at the end of that process, there has to be compassion. There has to be a specific care taken by the employer. So by analogy, there's certain important differences, but by analogy, the employer has already got this type of system. You already have experience to an extent with this. Just because it's COVID and just because it's a more dramatic or perceived dramatic topic, it certainly it can be done. And as it's heartening to see during the last month or two how properly applied a layered approach, a layered, nuanced policy certainly works. It can work. It works quite easily once applied properly. Now, those layers would include, and I'm generalizing now, and again, please bear in mind that your specific industry may need tweaks and differences in approach and philosophies. But a general policy would have a start, an education, a first level of education, where the employer tries to create certain bridges of trust, where it's made very clear that this is a problem-solving exercise. It's not a disciplinary process. If you get off on the wrong foot there, you're making your own task very much more difficult later on. This is not a disciplinary process. This is a joint problem-solving exercise where you try and get people to indicate. A lot of employees are only too happy that the employer will be doing this for them, that it's one less thing to worry about, and that the employer will, for example, pay for their vaccination. So right there at the first phase, you immediately remove, you immediately make your perceived problem smaller. Now, the remaining employees then need to enter a consultation process with you, where without, as the articles, for example, will tell you, where in a non-confrontational manner, you listen to their concerns, their fears, because remember, a lot of this is driven by WhatsApp videos and fear-mongering and disinformation. You really need to create a safe space for people to express their emotion healthily and completely. And not please don't treat that as another irritating thing. We've set aside an hour for this. Please hurry up. What is your problem? Why aren't you getting vaccinated? Approach that, create some space, and let them speak and let them share those concerns with you. Often we find now in practice, we find that very process brings enough fresh air and sunlight into the debate for people to be able to step away on their own from their fears, from their concerns. And from there on, you bring more nuance, you bring more, you tweak your process to deal with, for example, medical exemptions which are recognized legally internationally. People who have other concerns, medical concerns, and again, the prudent employer allows for that information to guide the process, to guide the decisions made. There could be valid exemptions. You make those exemptions, and you start building a momentum. You start showing your workforce that this is working, that there are good results. You create, on a subtle level, you create a form of peer pressure. You know, everyone is listening, everyone is participating, and people are changing their minds, people are getting vaccinated. You do all of this, you do with a good, solid written policy. You make it very clear what the steps entail, and you stick to your word, you stick to your time frames, and you listen to people, you help them through this problem solving from the beginning to the end. You work through your processes step by step. I'm happy to share a draft of that policy with you. And right at the end, and this is maybe the difficult part of our discussion, what if, and the question comes up often, what if at the end of all of it, and we've discussed all and considered and created alternatives, for example, working from home, taking a transfer, retraining, all those alternatives, we've done all of that, and there's still a few people who absolutely refuse, despite our best efforts, they refuse to be vaccinated. Now what? And that takes us back to our original point. There cannot be talk of mandatory vaccination in any real sense of the word. What is it that we're saying when we reach that point? What happens to those employees? We cannot at that stage now enforce vaccination. What we can do is deal with the consequences of that decision. So in a nutshell, given the time available to us, what happens to the remainders, the people who you have not convinced? Our advice to people at this stage is that at that stage you enter, and let's call it the final stage of your policy. And remember, it's got to be done in terms of your policy. You've consulted, you've ticked all of those boxes, and you've done it creatively, and you've done it with compassion. What about those last few? Our advice to employers is to then treat those as operational requirements. We have certain legal difficulties with whether that is a disciplinary in the sense of misconduct. We have dealt with 16 employees like that in the last 4 months that we've dealt with as operational requirements. Bottom line, short version of that is we then commence a retrenchment process, a Section 189 process, and treat them as operational. There's still dismissals, of course, but they are treated as operational requirement matters. I'm not sure how strong a case you can make for misconduct, but certainly from the employer's perspective, you have made you've consulted properly, you've got your workforce. Those who've changed their mind, you've done so in a very constructive manner and in a lasting manner, one that seeks to transcend their objections and not just sweep it under the rug. If you've done that properly, those last few that certainly in countrywide, in our experience in the last 2 months, you left with absolutely insignificant numbers, and all of them we've dealt with as operational matters, and those people have been retrenched in the normal course as if it was a normal retrenchment, which the employer can budget for and do as a normal process. We have not had one dismissal for misconduct, and that certainly is our advice. Until such time as the labour courts or higher court gives us more specific guidance in one or more judgments, that would certainly be the approach. Employers ask us a lot about their risk about that. How much are they at risk legally in following this process? Our advice is certainly that let's turn the coin around. There are two things that a claim like that would need to do. Let's say that you are an employee or someone who wants to sue the employer. You would need to show negligence by the employer, what is negligence? It is the deviation from that which is reasonable. And in September 2021, what is reasonable? The medical consensus is certainly in support of vaccinations. There's a ton of medical advice, and I would say medical consensus as far as the risk at the workplace is concerned, as far as COVID is concerned, and certainly it would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to make a case against an employer at this stage with a vaccination policy like that. To show negligence, that employer has deviated from what is reasonable. And the second thing, of course, which would be equally difficult to prove as a plaintiff in a matter like that against the employer is causation. Any medical situation arising from it, we don't believe that there's any argument to be made for a breach of constitutional rights. For insult value, any delict like that, and any medical consequences like that, again, would bring us back to those two requirements of negligence and causation. We believe that the employer is certainly well within their rights to have a policy like this. And again, we must warn against it's not just about that. It's not as easy as that. The employer at this stage runs the risk, in our view, a much bigger risk of when you don't have this type of policy. You are going to get into trouble because of your legal requirement to build and maintain a safe workplace. Employees are going to, the pro-vaccination people are going to start putting pressure on employers. And certainly there are other commercial incentives and disincentives such as insurance, international contracts. It really is developing on a weekly basis. Those are my preliminary thoughts. I believe that we have an opportunity for questions as well.
Yes, Andre, thank you very much. Thank you, Andre, for your insightful and informative talk. I think I don't only speak for myself, but for all the colleagues attending this session when I say that all of us have taken away something to ponder about and how to go about coming up with these policies. So colleagues, now we will be taking some questions in the chat box. So Andre, I have a couple of questions already in the chat box. So the first one says, it has been said that everybody can still get COVID-19, whether vaccinated or not vaccinated. So why would an employer's responsibilities to provide a safe working environment be different depending on whether they are dealing with vaccinated or unvaccinated people? I would have thought that the employer just needs to provide a COVID-19 safe working environment, which would be the same for both vaccinated and unvaccinated employees.
Very good and very prevalent question. We must understand what the vaccinations do. Vaccinations, as the question clearly implies, is not a silver bullet. It's certainly not once I'm vaccinated, I'm safe. That perception needs to go as well. It confuses the debate. What vaccination does is to improve your odds. What vaccination does is to improve my chances of A, not getting COVID, and B, if I do get it, to recover better and quicker and more completely. So the example I often use to explain the point is the use of safety hats and boots, for example. I could still die, I could still get injured on the factory floor, but wearing a helmet improves my chances of avoiding an injury, or then if I am injured, for the injury to be reduced in scope. So vaccinations are a lot like that, and I think that's where the criticism, certainly as we see from the lawyers' letters addressed to the employers at this stage already, at this early stage already, is that shade of grey, that percentage argument of vaccinations is still necessary. Maybe the easiest way to see it is that vaccinations improve employees' chances of being healthy, and being not vaccinated, as we see the statistics of last week. Being vaccinated, I have a better chance of not getting COVID, and should I get COVID, I have a better chance of recovery. And then not being vaccinated, would be the converse of that. And I'm waiting for. Remember, even if there's negligence, even if someone gets hurt at the workplace, even if they are negligent and cause it themselves, the employer still has obligations, legal obligations, and I would add ethical, moral obligations as well. So it's a question designed around percentages. It's a question of an improvement. Certainly not doing away with risk, but who's got the better percentages in risk and recovery.
All right, thank you, Andre. So the next question says, can you provide examples of exemptions from being vaccinated?
We've asked a medical team from Gauteng to assist us with that. So far, the examples that work, that seem rather uncontroversial, are medical exemptions relating to allergies of various. I'm not really talking about seasonal allergies. I'm talking about pretty serious medical allergies. We're talking about heart conditions, seem to be reasonably uncontroversial, and exemptions surrounding pregnancies seem to be. There seems to be, as far as I understand it, as a layman, there seems to be some pretty good arguments to be made for those as exemptions, and we find that backed by medical reports, the employers are very easy to convince to make those exemptions. We've made a distinction between temporary exemptions and permanent ones, such as the pregnancy versus, say, for instance, a heart condition. And I would argue, and our advice to employers is to keep an open mind at this stage. I think the vote is still out on the list of that. Certainly, if it's backed by medical science, we're happy to make that exemption.
Okay, so we have another question here from Hassan Kasim, and they're asking, hi, Andre, many employers have indicated that the consequence for refusing to vaccinate could lead to dismissal. From your experience dealing with employers, are they willing to accept the consequences for negative side effects of the vaccine?
Thanks, Hassan. No, the short answer is no, and they say no because it's all so vague at the moment as far as that is concerned, and I suppose part of the answer there is that legally it's going to be incredibly difficult to make a case, in our view, to make a case against the employer. You'd obviously, it's dependent on the facts, but you'd need to show how would you establish negligence, for example? How would you, at this stage, how would you argue that they have deviated from a reasonable approach? How would you even prove causation? It's not impossible, but certainly very, very difficult to prove. And I think that leads to employers being extremely, they're certainly not interested in that. What we found in Van der Bijl and Cape Town is two employers, and maybe you can consider this, simply to move the process along and based on their own confidence in this not going wrong. They have in their policies, they've written in certain very well circumscribed consequences where they will assist, to answer your question, where if A and B happens and it's backed by medical certificates, we will pick up the tab to the tune of X rand. So that is certainly one of the creative options that we see people coming up with as part of this consultation process. And that's, I think, the value of the consultation process, where it's not just another tick box situation where specific employers sit down with their employees and they craft solutions to this. Because that's the good news in all of this. If we take that approach, if we spend a bit more time, if we're patient with this, if we're skillful with this, then certainly much of the objections simply disappear, as we see in that example.
So another question here from Willow, and they're asking, how does one approach those who are unsure of vaccines because there are conflicting views of credible scientists on both sides? In other words, new research comes to light all the time and the science is not settled.
You know, it's sad to see how, especially on social media, how we've become so polarized, and firstly, I don't think the science is all that settled with in every respect. It is in some and it's not in others, and I think it's just honest and ethical to acknowledge that. And secondly, as the articles will show you as well, as social science and psychology tells us, and conflict research shows us, that is no way to, no one gets sneered or insulted into a new worldview. And that is where employers can go wrong. We need to sit with people, we need to work with their perceptions, their information. Now, if you do it, and we deal with that in some of the articles, if you do it the right way, to confront them with your YouTube videos, with your expert, is counterproductive. And is certainly, the harder you try, the more difficult and the more damage you do. But if you approach it the right way, to answer the question, there is a right way of dealing with that, with their information, and to show them, to lead them to a place where, you know, where at your workplace, where you come to solutions. You're certainly not going to coerce them out of it. You're certainly not going to badger them out of that. As tempting and as much of human nature as that is, employers must really steer clear of that. It's not going to work, and it's probably going to end up with legal debates later on. We must remember this is identity. This is value stuff. People. You can argue, you can tell them, sign here, get vaccinated by Friday, or you're fired. That's tempting. Who's got time for all this nonsense? But that is going to end up in tears, as they say. That is, you know, if you really want to take the only way out of this dilemma is to convince your employees to come along, and that's not a simple job.
So we have a question here from Masasane, and they're asking, would you consider a requirement to produce proof of having been vaccinated to access a premises or institution as part of providing a safe working environment? How far is this from mandatory vaccination, especially for employees?
The criticism is that in saying that we're not dealing with mandatory vaccinations, we're dealing with consequences, that's just playing with words, and that, you know, if dealing with consequences, it does indirectly make it mandatory. I don't agree with that. I think the times we're weeks away from having exactly that, where we'll need to show a passport. We'll need to be able to show our employers that we are vaccinated, and that is part of that's of course one of the challenges that you need to build into your policy. What we found on certain factories is that people go away and come back and say, I am vaccinated, but I refuse to show you that because it's confidential medical information. So your policy needs to be ahead of that. To answer the question, I think we will get there. I think we certainly, to give integrity to this policy, you're going to need to be able to prove that you did that, and I think there are only a few ways of doing that effectively.
So another question we have is, can the employer dismiss unvaccinated employees based on incapacity after extensive consultation?
I wouldn't take that. I wouldn't take that angle, because in doing that, in ticking that box, the employer picks up the onus to prove incapacity, and now you've made a hard job just harder by alleging that employee is incapable of doing his or her job. I think it can work. I can see avenues that that could be successful, but certainly that is not that's certainly not the clever option. It's not the easy option. Operational requirements would be the best. If we draw up a list, I would feel that even a misconduct argument is stronger than an incapacity one.
Mm-hmm. So another question here is, Dr. Anthony Fauci is on record as stating that fully vaccinated individuals have the same potential to transmit COVID as non-vaccinated. If this is true, surely the case to limit individual rights is therefore weakened.
Well, the discussion breaks down right at the start, because it's Fauci says that's not what he means, that's not what he said, so we've got trouble right there. I think at this stage, and this is the driver of the debate at this stage, is that at the workplace, being vaccinated reduces the risk and increases the rate of recovery. I think that's a strong enough argument. But I think it raises another very important point. I think it is ethically dishonest for an employer to drive this agenda simply for the sake of it. Your policy, if you draft it properly, your policy should be driven continuously, should be dynamic, and should be driven by nothing other than the science. And if the science should change, let's use this example. If the science should change, if the medical consensus, the general medical consensus should change, your policy shouldn't be requiring any huge changes. Your policy should always be that which is best for a balancing act between the rights of the employer, the employee, the clients, the service providers. So your science should drive your policy. And if Fauci or whoever else tells us in a week's time or in a month's time that vaccination is maybe not the solution, then your policy should simply be dynamic enough to move with that. At this stage, however, if the policy gets implemented today for consultation, I'm on my way to fly to Johannesburg to do exactly that. At this stage, our sense of the medical consensus at this stage is that vaccinations, simply put, it's better to be vaccinated at the workplace than to not be vaccinated.
All right, colleagues. So next, we are going to commence with the lucky prize draw and choose a winner for the 1,000 Rand Take-A-Lot voucher. So I'm just going to draw someone's name. So the winner is Michelle Hammer, the SARIR projects lead from the South African National Biodiversity Institute. Congratulations, Michelle. You are the winner of our 1,000 Rand Take-A-Lot voucher. So, colleagues, we usually end the session at 9:45. However, Andre has offered to stay an additional 15 minutes till 10 o'clock to continue with the question and answer session. So I'll continue reading some of the questions that we have from the chat box, and we will conclude the meeting at 10 o'clock. So, Andre, to continue with the questions, there's another one here. It says, if the vaccination protects against severe symptoms and potential death, then why be concerned about those who choose not to be vaccinated?
It's also a very popular question. And the replies from the doctors, we get that at every factory that we work at. The answer lies again in the percentages. If I am, the one doctor explained it to me this way, put in percentages, rough percentages, just to illustrate the point. If I'm vaccinated, I still run the risk of being infected. It's not a silver bullet. And if you are not vaccinated, you are a greater spreader of that. So in allowing unvaccinated people at the workplace, we are increasing everyone's risk. Let's approach it from this angle. If we're all vaccinated at the workplace, there's still a risk of infection. There's still a risk of falling ill. But the risk is lower, and the chances of recovery are better. So both sides of that coin. So we're looking at the percentages now. If we have some vaccinated people and some unvaccinated people, the vaccinated people, and here's where the argument comes from, and the employer's duty comes from, is that even your vaccinated people are still at risk. Whatever that percentage is, it's still a preventable illness. It's still a percentage game where my chances of not falling ill are better if we're all vaccinated than if some of us are unvaccinated. Belela, if you can hear me, you seem to have been muted.
Oh, apologies, Andre. So another question here is, there are extensive arguments as to how to deal with non-compliance with mandatory vaccination policy in the event of refusal to vaccinate. Arguments are quite divided among incapacity, retrenchment, and misconduct for failure to execute an instruction or insubordination. What is your take?
Both the advice and the experience in the trenches so far would be to obviously you can use all three depending on the actual facts, and here's part of the value of a patient process. If an employee or their representatives should create incidents of misconduct, then use that if you can't convince them. But our favorite approach, certainly legally and we would say ethically, is the retrenchment, the operational requirement argument. And that is at the end of, I think your policy should make provision for all of it, for all three categories, but certainly all 16 cases that we couldn't convince out of a few thousand countrywide so far. All 16 of them were treated as operational requirements. And I must say, with two exceptions, all of them are outside the 30-day period. We've had absolutely no comebacks from them. People seem to think if you do the process correctly, they seem to reluctantly agree with you at the end of the process that you've done it the right way. You didn't judge me. You didn't criticize me. We can't make progress. We can't. Our minds didn't meet. I understand your point. You understand mine. So maybe it is time to part ways and call that a retrenchment. It does a lot less damage to this person's CV, to the employment record. They get, in most instances, they get some sort of a retrenchment package. It's in our view and advice. It certainly is it's still not pleasant, but it's the least bad option.
We have a good question here from Paul Murray, and he's asking, do you think we will start seeing vaccination being used as a requirement when employing new staff?
Great question, Paul, and the answer comes in two parts. If a new contract should, depending on the employer's own perspective, of course, new contracts should now make this a requirement. Because remember, part of the difficulties of the debate come from the argument and the criticism that this is a unilateral change of my employment conditions. When I started working with you, you didn't want this. Now you're putting me through this requirement, and that's a pretty strong argument. A new employee starting with you today, if that contract in clause 11 says that this is a condition, then it's an entirely different debate, and it's a much easier debate for the employer to handle, because this is now a condition. If you don't like this condition, don't apply. And you could at least argue consensus between the parties if I signed that contract, if I accept it that way. But I'm also expecting to see the same debate, the same fight being carried in that direction, because I want the job, I am qualified, but I refuse to be vaccinated and I refuse to sign this contract. So I'm expecting some disputes and conflict on that basis as well. It seems to change the argument, and it does in certain important respects, but it's still, the question is still, is an employer allowed to have this as a requirement at the workplace? And are you not, if we had to bring this application on behalf of an applicant, you would say that I qualify in every other way, that this is discrimination against me. It's an unfair requirement. We've already have precedent on the basis of race and gender and so on. This would fall very much in that category of argument.
Okay, so Willow asks, what about making exceptions for employees who have valid medical concerns or who have proof for natural immunity or antibodies after already having COVID?
The policy, all of them should. You cannot, in our view, you really cannot exclude this part. It would make a nonsense of a proper consultation process by excluding these possibilities. Now, Willow's question, the answer would depend very much on the specific industry. Are you a frontline health worker? Are you a restaurant worker? Are you a teacher, for example? Or are you an IT guy that fixes people's computer remotely? So that's part of the answer. All of it, a dynamic, prudent policy should make provision for this to be discussed. It should be investigated, and if the facts warrant it, certainly those exemptions should be allowed. Very much so. It would be very risky to refuse to exclude them on that basis. Obviously, depending on the facts, you can't just claim it. You need to show it.
Okay, so we have a question here. So it says, if you retrench, you cannot fill those positions for a period of 12 months. Might not be the best solution from an operational point of view.
That depends on remember, it's actually a very good question. Practically, a mistake that certainly gets made by a lot of employers. Let's say we reach the end of your consultation process, that part of the policy. They then immediately move over to, let's say, a retrenchment process. Retrenchment. You refuse to be vaccinated, so from Monday you are retrenched. Your service contract is terminated. Or your correct policy should be that we've now reached an impasse and we cannot move further. And the normal Section 189 process should start there. Now, operational requirements are wide enough. We find it in practice, your normal retrenchment, that 12-month period can, in our view, be circumvented if in these instances. The operational requirements are now not a lack of funding, for example, or a redundancy of the position. By definition, remember your consultation process would have taken care of this now. Your operational requirements here are the lack of consensus caused by the pandemic. We believe that you can make a serious enough case for that person for that position to be full, even though it's treated as an operational requirement. It's a very good question, and that I'm sure that will be tested very much. Remember, just to finish that specific question, that 12-month period, for example, in practice under normal commercial terms, simply means that after 3 or 4 months, I can now afford you. I should give you the retrenchee. I should give you preference to take you back. This cannot happen here because, I suppose you could approach it that way to ask you 4 months later, are you now prepared to be vaccinated? But in all probability, the problem is going to remain the same for that 12-month period. So there's no point. If you approach it and you do your process correctly, your operational requirements can certainly. It's one of those instances where appointing someone in your position could be justified.
So Tammy is asking, if an employer requires employees to be vaccinated, then shouldn't the employer provide a safe environment by ensuring that their clients whom their employees are exposed to should also be expected to show proof of vaccination? And if the employer cannot show this, would it be prudent to say that the employees are thus also being exposed to an unsafe working environment?
Wonderful question, and I'm expecting conflict to. I have absolutely no doubt that we're going to see situations like that arising. The difference is, remember, the employer has a certain relationship, with an ongoing relationship with the employee. That's the foundation of this debate. You work for me, I pay you, I train you, you deliver a service, I can demand, I have a legal duty. A very clear legal duty to provide a safe working place for you. That triggers that debate. The employer doesn't have that relationship, that contractual relationship with the client, which could be a once-off, a walk-in, and so on. So there's no way of really forcing the client, unless you want to argue around, private property and things like that. Stick a sign on your door. You could do that, but I'm waiting for an employee to say that you are allowing unvaccinated clients to come in, and thereby you putting me at risk. I don't think there's much distinction between that argument and arguing why are you allowing unvaccinated colleagues of mine to work with me and share my space. I really think an employee would be able to make a very interesting argument about you putting me in harm's way by allowing unvaccinated clients to come. It could lead to all sorts of commercial absurdities, but I have no doubt that we're going to have that debate, certainly. And I think an employee would be justified in raising those concerns. And again, maybe in a reverse way, having those conversations with the employers to what can we do to remove or reduce our risk. So it's a very valid concern.
So I'll take 2 more questions. So the one says, on Twitter yesterday, you had a discussion about religious exemptions to vaccination. Have you reached any conclusions yet?
I can answer that by saying that personally, I don't, and please don't misunderstand me. I don't believe that religious objections will, as I understand them, and I still have to do the homework on specific religions, but I don't believe that a religious objection would carry much weight in serving as an absolute exemption. I say this with full respect to all religions. I say this simply because, firstly, I don't think that so far, it seems an absolute rarity amongst religions to have a cogent argument against vaccinations. And secondly, the policing of it would be so difficult. Are you a follower of this religion? Since when are you a real follower? It would open a very difficult debate. But again, it's an example of why this policy should be such a constructive process and not a tick box approach. Where listen to that person. Certainly, that debate. If a person raises that as an objection, as a possible objection, it needs to be dealt with. It needs to be discussed. And if the employer wishes to exclude or to take that argument off the table, the employer would certainly, in my view, and in our advice would certainly carry the onus to show why this argument isn't sufficient to warrant an exemption.
Okay, so the last question is, Andre, the directive from the Department of Employment and Labor requires employers to make reasonable accommodation for employees who have a legitimate reason to refuse. Such reasonable accommodation to be done in the terms of the Code of Conduct, the Code of Good Practice on Disability. This requires employers to demonstrate one of two grounds before dismissals can take place. One, the reasonable accommodation is too expensive, or two, the reasonable accommodation will interrupt the operation of the business. Has this changed to your knowledge to allow for dismissals based on operational requirements?
We've dealt with that when it came out in June, was it? Early July. And we believe, and certainly our experience since then, and this includes extensive consultations with unions and with attorneys so far, have shown that list is simply not. It was, in fairness to the department, it was conveyed as guidelines. It's not sufficiently comprehensive to deal with all the situations and objections arising. It should include quite a few other aspects. It's simply the list doesn't work in practice, and we found on the one hand, as part of the consultation process, we found a very long list of other exclusions that are acceptable. And we must remember here, I wouldn't want to see, and I think it would be an exercise in futility to have a one-size-fits-all policy. It depends on so many factors, such as size of your workforce, the type of industry you're in. I would much rather like to see a negotiated, a tailor-made, an organic policy that is the product of a respectful dialogue between employers and employees, and that is your policy, a live document that grows with what happens at that workplace, not as we're having now, a sort of a general discussion.
All right, colleagues, that was the last question. Thank you so much for such an interactive question and answer session. And in conclusion, I would like to thank Andre for his brilliant presentation and sharing his knowledge with us. Thank you to all of you colleagues who joined the PURCO SA Ponder presentation series. And thanks to Davy for assisting in hosting the event. Thank you, colleagues, and goodbye.
Thank you.